Hello, students. I hope you have gone through my two lectures on the ELT, especially discussing the scope of language, English language, and also the history or a brief introduction to the ELT, English language teaching, how it developed, etc. In today's lecture, I just want to begin the methods of ELT, that is, various methods that are there in English language teaching. And let us start with the introduction to methods and how and why they have evolved. Let us have a historical perspective, and then let us discuss one method for today's class, that is the direct method. Okay, let me share my screen. Yeah, I hope you are able to see my screen. So today, in the methods of ELT, as we have realized in the previous lecture that there are many methods and approaches to English language teaching. And in as part of your study in the first unit, you have some methods and approaches that are prescribed for your study. So today, I just want to focus on the grammar translation method. Okay, before going into the method, actually, let us see how and why these methods have evolved. Okay, if we go into the reviewing of the history of language teaching methods, it provides a background for discussion of contemporary methods. Actually, if we go into the history and look into the history, we will have the roots of these development of these contemporary methods, which we are speaking of in the historical roots of the language teaching itself. Okay, so this historical perspective reveals that the concerns that have prompted modern methods of innovations were similar to those that have always been at the center of discussions on how to teach foreign languages. Actually, Chaucer, and why Chaucer is considered as the father of English literature. It is not because he's the first one to write in English, but and produce some worthable or recognized as good works. He's not the only one, but before him also there were some writers. But we actually the literary scholars and historians have given the credit of father of English literature to Chaucer. Why? Because he started writing in English. Okay, when people were actually writing in Latin and then Greek, etc., Chaucer has taken the then it was English was the vernacular or the language of common people. Chaucer has taken that language and he started writing in English, and that is the time when English actually began to flourish. At that time, when this language is flourishing, another language is going back, and that is nothing but Latin. The Latin language, which was the language of court, etc., the church. Then Latin got a setback when people started writing in English and speaking in English, etc. So, actually, if you look into this history of England, we see that after the Latin was set back, there were attempts to teach Latin in schools because they were considered as classical languages, and reading the classical literature, of course, is the doorway to enlightenment or intellectuality, etc. So teaching Latin was not stopped in England, though people stopped, using Latin as a spoken English, or writing in Latin has decreased. Latin was still being taught in the schools at that time. Okay, so at that time also, teaching a foreign language, the sole aim behind language teaching is to make one well versed in the language or fluent in the language. You know, as now we are, you are learning English language, it is only to become what you say, fluent in English language, as it is the aim now behind the language teaching. That was the aim at that time also. So the aim was never changed. It was there and it is now, it is here now. So the concerns of language teachers at that time and right now are one and the same. So this will be revealed when we go back into the history and see how language was taught. Okay, changes in language teaching methods throughout history have reflected recognition of changes in the kind of proficiency learners needed. You know, when you are learning a language, what do you need? Is it only to read that you learn a language, or is it only to write that you need a language? No, we need always the four skills, LSRW. But previously, when Latin was being taught in the schools, in spite of its absence in the society, when the language is not being spoken anymore in the society, the focus was on, only on writing and then reading. Okay, and actually what it was away from what you call the usual aim of learning a language, that is the fluency in talking or the proficiency. Okay, so here changes in language teaching methods throughout history have reflected recognition of changes in the kind of proficiency learners needed, such as a move towards oral proficiency rather than reading comprehension as the goal of language studying. So, when Latin was taught, it was aimed to impart the reading skills from the books and also to write through translations. But gradually it changed. Now, instead of having the reading and writing skills, they wanted more proficiency in speaking. It is not simply a reading comprehension. The goal of language learning is not simply the language comprehension, but a oral, an oral proficiency. So proficiency is proficiently, how fluently you can talk. So the goal of the language teaching and language learning simultaneously kept on changing from one century to the other. But whenever it was whenever it was there, it was more on the oral proficiency rather than on simple reading comprehension and writing skills. So they have also reflected changes in theories of the nature of language and of language learning. This change of goals actually made the scholars or the critics or language experts or teachers to think of more new ways how to make the learner proficient in the target language. So that is why the goals kept on changing, and this what you say, intention to change the goals is actually reflected in theories of the nature of language. And they try to probe into the nature of language and also language learning in order to come out with different methods of teaching, so to increase the proficiency of the learner. So here Kelly and Hobart, the two language experts, ELT experts, they demonstrated that many current issues in language teaching are not particularly new. See, 20th century has abundant or so many ELT theories of English language teaching, as I have introduced to you in the second lecture. There are so many, but these language, researchers, writers, they say that there is nothing new even in the current issues of language teaching, because if you examine the history that was there in the previous era also, or the previous time also. So today's controversies reflect contemporary responses to questions that have been asked often throughout the history of language teaching. So they say that whatever questions are being asked today are the questions that were already asked if you examine the history of English language teaching. Perhaps this is the same with the teaching of any language, rather it is only English language teaching. So thus the seeds of methods of ELT can be traced in the methods used to teach Latin till 18th century in England. I hope you might have guessed why I took the example of Chaucer at the very beginning of this lecture, to give you how Latin was set back after people started, or writers or poets started writing in English. Okay, so then there was a situation where Latin, should be taught as a foreign language. Okay, and for to teach this foreign language, they have adopted some methods, and they, this thus the modern methods, whichever we are speaking of now, the seeds of these methods can be traced back to the methods that were used to teach Latin in 18th century England. That actually started from 16th century itself, when Latin was set back, and Latin is no more a language of the common man. It is not the language of languages spoken by people outside, but English has taken its place. But the Latin and Greek, of course, has retained their what you say significant status in the literary or in the intellectual, among the intellectual of the society, that it is the classical language and it need to be taught to children, so to educate them or enlighten them, because learning Latin or reading Latin classics was felt to be the doorway for enlightenment and intellectuality. Okay, so children who wanted to learn Latin used to be given a rigorous introduction in Latin grammar. So how this language was taught? This language actually was taught with, after learning the alphabet, it is all about the Latin grammar, which was taught through not which was taught through rote learning of grammar rules. You have to by heart the grammar rules. You might have by hearted the grammar rules of English language also, when it was being taught to you in your high school standards, or even the elementary schools, where take for example, let me give you this example, like articles. So there are three articles like a and the, and a and are indefinite articles. The is the definite article. Like that, grammar rules, you might have by hearted. And the same situation was there in England, when teachers tried to teach Latin language to the school students, and they were actually exposed to the rigorous training in the Latin grammar rules, study of declensions and conjugations, translation and practice in writing sample sentences, sometimes with the use of parallel bilingual texts and dialogue. So it is not simply grammar rules, but it is the study of declensions, how and where they are applied, how there will be an exception to the rules, etc., and what are the conjugations and how to translate, and practice in writing. a practice in writing sample sentences. Say one sentence is given, and in the similar manner, the students are asked to develop the sample sentences, sometimes with the use of parallel bilingual texts. So they are, this is taught through actually the mother tongue also. Like, along with grammar, it is translation also. I know, translation into the native language or mother tongue. Okay, and this is how children in the 18th century England, or even before that, were used to taught Latin language. Giving in all this discussion, one thing you have to remember is the emphasis on learning the grammar rules. Okay, so once basic proficiency was established, students were introduced to the advanced study of grammar and rhetoric. Once they are able to read Latin and write in Latin or translate in Latin, they were introduced to the advanced study of grammar and also rhetoric in that. School learning, of course, as you might have suffered learning English at this in your childhood, the same was the situation for the students in England, where they had a very deadening experience of learning the Latin, because there used to be brutal punishments also if they failed to learn. Okay, there were of course, besides this way of teaching the grammar rules and then practicing the translation, there were occasional attempts to promote alternative approaches to teach Latin, but they were never popular, or they were never, what you say, adopted. Okay. In this regard, Roger Ascham and Montaigne in the 16th century, and Comenius and John Locke in the 17th century had made specific proposals for curriculum reform and for changes in the way Latin was taught. But since Latin had for so long been regarded as the classical and therefore most ideal form of language, it was not surprising that ideas about the role of language study in the curriculum reflected the long established status of Latin. So, though changes were proposed, they were not accepted, considering the ideal status of language, and language that is Latin, and also the dignity that was attached to learning of Latin, etc. So there were, though changes were proposed, these changes did not enter into the teaching actually. So as modern languages began to enter the curriculum European schools in the 18th century, they were taught using the same basic procedures that were used for teaching Latin. So in the similar manner, I told you that English was not taught in England until it started in India, during its colonial period. So when the modern languages like French or Italian and some Spanish, some other languages also came into England or in any part of the world, those languages are also, used to taught in the same model in which Latin was, taught. Okay, and textbooks consisted of statements of abstract grammar rules, lists of vocabulary, and sentences for translation. So what they have, your Wren and Martin grammar book is one example for this. Though it is not, there is no translation. It is only rules providing for the grammar, to get a good command on the grammar rules. As I told you, always it is the Wren and Martin, though translation is absent there. So how grammar rules were prescribed. Okay, so textbooks consisted of statements of abstract grammar rules and vocabulary, and sentences for translation were prescribed for these students who were studying not only Latin but any other modern language. So speaking the foreign language was not the goal here. See, At that time, when a foreign language is being taught, the main purpose of teaching that foreign language was only to expose the student to the great literature that was produced in that language, but not speaking in the foreign language as we are trying now. Okay, the focus has changed, but the methods are similar. That is what is the historical review of the methods of teaching will reveal to us. Okay, of course, sometimes the focus is there, yet speaking is not the primary focus. And oral practice was limited to students reading aloud the sentences they had translated. So whatever sentences they have translated, they used to read aloud. That is the reading practice that was given to the students. Okay, these sentences were constructed to illustrate the grammatical system of the language. Not all the sentences, those sentences which are helpful to illustrate or to exemplify the grammatical system of the language were taken into consideration. Consequently, they bore no relation to the language of real communication. Our textbook language is different and our communicative language is different. Okay, so whatever they have learned is only textual language only, and this language that they are learning in the classroom by using the grammar rules, etc., or translation, has no similarity to the real communication in that language. And students use it to labor over translating sentences. Okay, by the 19th century, this approach based on the study of Latin had become the standard way of studying foreign languages in schools. As it started around 16th or 17th centuries, after 2 centuries or so, in 19th century, it became a standard way of studying the foreign languages in school. Okay, and the textbooks that were developed during the 19th century also, based upon this grammar and translation method. A typical textbook of 19th century used to consist chapters or lessons organized around grammar points, and each grammar point was listed, rules on its use were explained, and it was illustrated by sample sentences. So 19th century textbook compilers were mainly determined to codify the foreign language into frozen rules of morphology and syntax to be explained and eventually memorized. So by the a language teaching method that was focusing on the grammar, rules and translation, etc., gradually stabilized itself from the 17th century onwards, and then it solidified its place in during the 19th century. And in this century there were textbooks that were aiding to this type of language teaching method, which was focusing more on the grammar of that foreign language. Okay, in this actually, in these textbooks, oral work was reduced to an absolute minimum. Okay, the focus was only on reading. Okay, and oral is not there, and only a handful written exercises. Okay, and they were constructed at random, came as a sort of appendix to the rules of grammar. Okay, so the immediate aim for the student was to apply the given rules by means of appropriate exercises. So the rules were given to you, and immediately you have to apply those rules and the appropriate exercises or situations. Okay, these textbooks divided into two parts. One part is giving the rules, and the other part is for sentences that are prescribed for translation, and the sole form of instruction was mechanical translation. So during this period, the instruction was used to carried out through a mechanical translation. Okay, this approach to foreign language teaching became known as the grammar translation method. See, before we say grammar translation method, it has a long history. The history spanning for centuries, and which gradually has developed and settled as the grammar translation method. And people say that it was the offspring of German scholarship, the object of which, according to one of its less charitable critics, was to know everything about something rather than the thing itself. It is to know English grammar rules. If someone is taught the language in this method, you will know all the rules, but you may not be able to communicate effectively or proficiently or fluently in the language. Okay, so this is what gradually have developed to be known as the grammar translation method. And what are the principal characteristics of this grammar translation method? I have listed out some principal characteristics. So the goal of foreign language study is to learn a language in order to read its literature, or in order to benefit from the mental discipline and intellectual development that result from foreign language study. This point I have already explained to you. So the grammar, emphasis on grammar and reading and translating the sentences was only to give an exposure to the literature, and also to draw the benefits of the mental disciplines or intellectual development that was attached to learning this foreign language or reading the foreign literature. Okay, so this was the goal of foreign language study. It is only to learn the language in order to read its literature. Okay, hence, and because of this goal, this method views language learning as consisting of little more than memorizing rules and facts in order to understand and manipulate the morphology and syntax of the foreign language. Actually, this method views language learning as a tool to understand and manipulate the morphology and syntax of the foreign language. And then next characteristic of this grammar translation method is the first language is maintained as the reference system in the acquisition of the second language. Okay, so mother tongue, we say mother tongue. Whether mother tongue helps the learning of the second language or not, it's a great debate. Okay, but at that time, in the grammar translation method, the first language is always maintained as the reference system to acquire the second language. Reading and writing are the primary focus in this method. See, listening and speaking are not at all emphasized. So reading and writing are the primary. In the grammar translation method of teaching, one is emphasizing on the reading and writing of the writing skills of that particular language rather than listening and speaking. Okay, the next characteristic is vocabulary selection is based solely on reading the text used. So how will you develop the vocabulary? How the vocabulary selection? It is based on the texts that are used for reading, and words are taught through bilingual word lists. So giving one word in the target language, and the other word, its meaning or whatever it is equivalent in the first language, that is the mother tongue or native language. So this is a bilingual method. And also vocabulary can be learned through dictionary study and then memorization. Okay, in a typical grammar translation text, the grammar rules are presented and illustrated. A list of vocabulary items are presented with their translation equivalents, and translation exercises are prescribed. This is the what you say what do you say, framework of a text that is based upon the grammar translation method of language teaching. Okay. Next, in this method, sentence is the basic unit of teaching and language practice. Okay, so sentence, they take sentences as the basic unit of teaching and language practice. Much of the lesson is devoted to translating sentences into and out of the target language, this way or this way. They take, for example, if you have English or Telugu, you translate from English to Telugu and Telugu to English. And it is this focus on the sentence that is a distinctive feature of this method. The focus on the sentence is the distinctive feature of the grammar translation method. And in this method, accuracy is emphasized very accurately. You have to, and students are expected to attain high standards in translation because of the high priority attached to meticulous standards of accuracy. Accuracy is very much emphasized in this method of teaching, and students are expected to learn the language accurately, meticulously, so as to cope to the number of texts, formal written examination, to go through the formal written examinations. Okay. In this method, another point is grammar is taught deductively, that is, by presentation and study of grammar rules. First, the grammar rules are presented, studied, and then they are applied, which are then practiced through translation exercises, deductive method. And in most grammar translation texts, a syllabus was followed for the sequencing of grammar points throughout a text. And there was an attempt to teach grammar in an organized and systematic way. So in the grammar translation method, the unique feature or the principal characteristic is organized. This teaching of grammar is very much organized in a systematic manner. And students' native language is the medium of instruction. So it is taught in the native language or mother tongue only. So this is the grammar translation method that was very prominent in teaching foreign languages in Europe from 1840s to 1940s. And in modified form, it continues to be widely used in some parts of the world today also. So I told you that though this period of 1840 and 1940 is given, this grammar translation method is very much exists, very much prominent or prevalent in teaching the foreign languages in Europe, especially England, even before the 19th century. So, and now we can't say that it is over. Grammar translation method is over. Nobody is using that. No, grammar translation method in a modified version is being used in different parts of the world even today. And in the mid and late 19th century, opposition to the grammar translation method gradually developed in several European countries. So in the mid, 1940s, if you say, the grammar translation was prevalent, and after that, an opposition, a reverse, what do you say, a dissatisfaction over the grammar translation method has developed in many European countries, and this reform movement, as it was referred to, laid the foundation for the development of new ways of teaching languages and raised controversies that have continued to the present day. So there was a uproar for the reform movement from the grammar translation method, and this was the foundation for the development of new ways of teaching language, which resulted in the development of so many methods of teaching, which somehow sometimes were controversial, and people started believing that this method is good or this method is bad, etc. But to be frank, we can say, as I have already explained you in the second lecture, there is no good method or bad method. Every method will have its own merits or demerits perhaps. But that the a long prevalent method like grammar translation method, which was very popular during the later half of the 19th century and early half of the 20th century, somehow got set back, and there came a reform movement which resulted in the development of new ways of teaching languages. And we will continue to learn the prescribed new methods or new ways of teaching language in the next lectures. I hope you have followed my lecture, and you might have got a better understanding of what grammar translation method is, and what is the history of this grammar translation method, how it started in England and how it was popularized, and later it of course was challenged, or it was felt that it is not good, etc. As I told you, every method will have advantages and disadvantages, and disadvantages of this grammar translation method were of uh, mm, brought into a prominent place during the second half of the 19th century, and that's why we have a reform movement. Okay, I hope you have followed what is the grammar translation method and what are the principal characteristics of this method of teaching. Okay, we'll continue in the next lecture with the next method. Have a nice time.